Today on Histories Tech, we are looking at the most produced tank of World War II, with more than 80,000 being produced over the course of its history, the T-34. Now, this tank has a rather long and unique history, with it going into development in 1937 and still seeing usage to this day. It holds a record for one of the longest used tanks in history. But let's go ahead and look at the origins and the history of the T-34 tank. Now, like so many other nations, during the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union began developing various types of tanks, and they ended up deploying two main types of tanks. There was the T-26, which was an infantry tank designed to be a little bit slower moving, but made to keep pace with troops and provide them support on the ground. The other one was the BT tank series, and this is what we would consider to be a cavalry tank, similar to the British cruiser tank. These were faster tanks, they were lighter, and they were designed for maneuverability in a warfare environment. Add to this the multi-turreted T-28 tank, and you have the mainstay of the fleet for Soviet tanks in the 1930s. Now, interestingly enough, all of these were influenced by foreign designs. The T-26 and T-28 are based upon British tanks, and the BT tanks are actually based upon the designs of American engineer J. Walter Christie. So by the time we get to the late 1930s, the Red Army has decided there is a need for a domestically produced tank that can actually replace all three of these tanks. So an engineer is brought in by the name of Mikhail Koshkin, and it is his job to design the replacement for these tanks. Now, the initial A-20 was a rather unique vehicle. One of the biggest features it had is that it did not utilize tracks. Instead, it ran an 8x6 wheel system to allow it to run on wheels instead of tracks, which allowed it to reach speeds of 53 miles per hour, but didn't give it any combat advantage. And with a few years, better tracks were developed and reincorporated into the A-20. Another major feature of it was its all-around sloped armor. Earlier tests had shown that sloped armor would actually be better at deflecting enemy shots, so it was decided that with this new type of tank, they would go with sloped armor for the entire hull of the tank. Now, into the late 38 into early 39, the Soviet Union got into a few skirmishes with the Japanese military and found that there were a lot of disadvantages to the armor setup on the T-26 and the BT tanks. Seeing these issues, Koshkin went back to Stalin and asked for permission to build a second prototype. This one would be heavily armed and armored with universal tank armor that would protect it from the tanks at the time and would replace the issues that the T-26 and BT tanks had. Now, while the A-32, as it was known, was shown to be heavier, sported heavier armor, a larger cannon on it, it was actually just as maneuverable as the A-30. And because of that, they went ahead and recognized that this was the superior tank design and decided that this was going to be the model that the T-34 was going to be based upon. From there, the pre-production model of the T-34 was developed, known as the A-34, and it integrated a lot of the final design features they wanted on this early T-34. Now, even with the final design approved and beginning development of the T-34, they ran into some more problems. First of all, no Soviet tank factory existed that could produce the heavy armor of the T-34, which led to some issues with the early tanks having defective armor plating. Additionally, radios were too expensive to produce for every tank, so only company commanders got them in their tanks. The L-11 gun that had been initially fitted to it didn't meet up to expectation and had to be replaced. Because of all these issues, only 400 tanks were able to be produced in the first year of production in 1940. However, they immediately switched to the 1941 production model, which had even thicker armor and a better radio setup and even a different gun. Now, it wouldn't be much longer after this that the T-34 would see its first combat action with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. Now, the Germans had sent in their mechanized armies expecting to face off against the T-26, the BT tanks, and even the T-28. They were not expecting the T-34 and its companion tank, the KV Heavy tank. And this was an absolute shock to the German military. Their tanks that they had deployed at the time, the Panzer IIs, were not able to go up against the T-34s. The T-34's heavy sloped armor basically proved that the weapons being used by the Germans at the time were inferior. And because of this, the Germans didn't know how to actually respond to the T-34 at the time. Now, the Germans quickly noted the superiority of the heavy sloped armor on the T-34 and that their weapons at the time could not counter it. However, it wouldn't take them long to adapt. They began to replacing their standard anti-tank guns with 105 mm field guns and 88 mm anti-aircraft guns and putting them in a direct fire role, meaning they were using these weapons that were not intended for an anti-tank role to take out T-34s. And while the T-34 was superior in many ways, tactical issues and development issues showed the lacking of the Soviet Red Army and the need to adapt and change. A series of improvements included better armor that was heavier but easier to utilize and manufacture. They also increased the fuel capacity, added more ammo storage. They actually redesigned the turret to make it a little bit more roomy. Now, only after 2 years of production, there were plans to actually replace the T-34 with the T-43. And this was supposed to be a universal model that could replace both the T-34 and the KV-1 heavy tank. Now, the T-43 was designed to be an improved version of the T-34, and it did have much heavier, superior armor, but it wasn't able to withstand those German 88 mm guns, and it was found to be much inferior to the T-34 in terms of maneuverability. And while they did share 70% of the same components, it would have required retooling and remanufacturing, and it would have slowed down the whole tank production. So the plan instead was to improve the T-34. Now, the Germans had begun fielding their new Tiger I tanks in 43, and it was found that the T-34 76 mm gun could not penetrate the Tiger's armor. However, the 85 mm anti-aircraft gun being utilized at the time could. So the plan was to take an 85 mm anti-aircraft gun and put it on a T-34, and thus we get the T-34-85 model. And while it couldn't match the later Panther and Tiger tanks, the improved firepower allowed it to be much more effective than earlier models and made it much more cost effective against heavier German tanks. And with this new improved T-34, we would see the career of it really continue to grow. It would be basically taken out of service by the Soviet Union in the 1950s, but still used by multiple militaries such as China, the North Koreans. It would be utilized during the Angolan Civil War, conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East, and a few other minor conflicts around the world. And it'd be heavily exported around the world. And because of this, there's actually a lot of variants made by nations around the world for this tank. Now, many of the variants utilized are basically improvements, better armor, better hull, drivetrains, things like that. However, there are quite a few that are rather unique, such as the Israeli-made T-100, which utilized a 100 mm anti-tank gun. Other tank destroyers include this one here, the Su-100, developed by the Soviet Union and later utilized by the Russian military. Crane tanks and recovered vehicles like the SPK-5 seen here, or even repair vehicles like seen here with this WPT-34, to name a few of these unique variants. Now, with more than 80,000 T-34s produced, they can be seen around the world. And in fact, as of some recent data from 2023, 7 nations still deploy T-34s to this day, usually in a reserve or training capacity, but they are still serviceable vehicles. And there are hundreds of examples of T-34s in museums around the world and private collections. And interestingly enough, the average price of these is fetching about $20,000 to $40,000, meaning they are much more affordable of a tank than some of the others in the world that you could purchase. But there you have it, a quick look at the T-34, a tank with a history that is more than 80 years of service around the world, that is still easy to visit and can even be purchased to this day. Some people do consider this the greatest tank ever built. Others have issues with it. Love it or hate it, it does have a unique history all of its own. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.